We're taught that matter is mute, that stone is lifeless, that the material world is passive, inert, cold, unaware. But ancient cultures never saw it that way. To them, matter was memory, not metaphorically, but literally. Stone didn't just endure, it held, it recorded, not with ink, but with vibration, not with syntax, but with presence. When the ancients carved a shape into a rock, they weren't only marking it, they were inviting it to hold something, a symbol, a prayer, a thought stretched beyond the edge of language. And the stone, it didn't resist, it listened, it absorbed. Because matter may not speak the way we do, but it responds to rhythm, to pattern, to intention. This is what we've forgotten, that the physical world is not indifferent, it's porous, and intention, when focused, can become a kind of imprint, not metaphorically, energetically. That's why pyramids were made of stone, why sacred texts were etched in tablets, why circles of stone still stand in fields where no one remembers their names, but everyone feels something when they stand among them. Because the stone remembers. Even when the mind forgets, even when history turns to silence, even when science reduces it to weight and chemistry, the stone still holds. And that's why ancient mystics didn't treat stones as objects. They treated them as witnesses. And when they wanted to preserve something deeper than knowledge, they placed it there, in the stillness of matter, in the silence that doesn't fade. This was not superstition, it was precision, a different kind of language. And the stone? It still carries those sentences long after the mouth that spoke them is dust. Because matter is not mute, it remembers. Not all shapes are equal. Some resonate, some open, some hold. This is something ancient cultures understood intuitively, that geometry is not just form, it is function of meaning. When a mystic chose a stone, they didn't just pick what was nearby. They chose for shape, for density, for symmetry, for silence. Because every form carries a frequency, and the shape of a stone is part of how it holds what you give it. A sphere retains, a point directs, a spiral remembers what flows, a cube stabilizes. These aren't metaphors, they are maps of how matter behaves under the weight of consciousness. You don't just place intention into an object, you place it into a structure that will carry it. This is why the ancients carved circles into monoliths, why labyrinths were laid in stone under sacred floors, why symbols geometric, simple, impossible, were etched in everything from tombs to tools. Because shape speaks. And stone, when paired with geometry, becomes a vessel for something living. It becomes a mnemonic field, a landscape of intention made still. This is what charging a stone really meant. Not magic, not wishful thinking, but patterned placement of will into a medium that responds by remembering. The geometry was the grammar, the stone was the page, the intention was the ink, and once inscribed, the message stayed, not by force, by form. And this is the part modern minds often miss. It's not just that matter can carry meaning, it's that it can carry it better when shaped with care. That's why the shape matters, why the carving matters, why the act of placing, aligning, holding matters. Because what you place into the world is shaped by what holds it. The ancients didn't carve geometry into stone for beauty. They did it for continuity. They wanted the message to survive them. And so they put it in something that wouldn't forget. In the modern world, the word ritual often feels like fiction, like fantasy, like play. But to the ancient mind, Ritual wasn't escape, it was precision. Ritual was how you focused intention until it was sharp enough to pierce matter. Because the mystic knew, you cannot charge a stone with a distracted mind. You cannot impress meaning into form while thinking of what you'll have for dinner. Ritual wasn't about superstition, it was about attention. A narrowing of awareness until everything outside the act falls away. The breath slows, the body stills, the hands move deliberately. The voice, if it speaks at all, does so with purpose, not as performance, but as transmission. Because matter doesn't respond to fantasy, it responds to focus. You could not program a stone by simply wanting something. You had to become what you wanted to place into it. Peace couldn't be placed through stress. Clarity couldn't be embedded with confusion. Power couldn't be summoned through ego. You had to enter the same frequency you wished the stone to carry. That's why ritual mattered. It calibrated the self so that the imprint could be clean. Think of a ritual not as superstition but as software, not because it casts a spell, but because it orders consciousness. It gives shape to thought, it gives time to intention, it gives place to energy so it can land and remain. This is why rituals were always slow, why incense burned, why silence was held, why breath and movement were counted. Because meaning takes space to land, and ritual made that space visible. So when a mystic placed their hands on a stone and whispered something inward, they weren't pretending, they were concentrating. And that concentration over time left a trace, a presence, a memory that outlived the mouth that spoke it. This wasn't imagination, it was embodiment. And the stone, it listened, and it still does. What happens when you sit in deep feeling, not fleeting emotion, but sustained awareness? Something begins to settle. A subtle field forms. A mood thickens into meaning. And when you direct that meaning with clarity, it leaves a mark. Not on your skin, not on your screen, but on the space around you, and if you choose it carefully, on matter. This is what the ancients understood, that consciousness leaves fingerprints, not metaphorically, energetically, structurally. They believed intention wasn't just thought, it was a force, and that force, when held with enough stillness and repetition, could imprint itself into stone, not by magic, by resonance. Just as a sound can cause sand to form geometric shapes, or a magnet aligns the chaos of particles into order, consciousness, when focused, can organize the fabric of matter. This was the hidden layer behind stone charging. Not an activation, a communion. You don't force your energy into the object, you offer it, you harmonize with it. You hold the same emotion, thought, presence, until the form begins to reflect it back. Because the more present you are, the more matter responds. Why do you feel calm around certain stones? Why do some temples feel thick with stillness? Why do objects in old sacred spaces seem to hum with memory? Because something was placed there, not visibly but vibrationally. It was felt in, breathed into, held, spoken without words, and matter remembered. This isn't mysticism, it's memory. Your phone carries your fingerprint. A stone can carry your state. Not forever, but for long enough to remind you of what you once placed. That's why mystics didn't charge stones for vanity. They did it for anchoring, so that when clarity faded, they could touch the object and return to it, to that presence, that prayer, that version of themselves that once sat in full attention. The stone wasn't magical, it was loyal. It didn't change the world. It held the part of you that believed you could. Stones have always been there, before paper, before language, before even memory. They do not move, but they remain, and in their stillness, they remember. That's why the ancients trusted them, not as objects of worship, but as witnesses. In temples, the walls were stone, not because it was durable, but because it could hold the weight of ritual. In tombs, the sarcophagus was stone, not just for protection, but because death was a threshold that deserved a witness who could not forget. Stone didn't speak, it listened, and it remembered long after the speaker was gone. Think of the standing stones in forgotten fields. Think of the pyramids, the ziggurats, the stone circles aligned with stars we no longer track. These were not random. They were statements. They were records of attention, of prayer, of presence. Not in language, but in structure. Because once something is carved into stone, not just physically, but energetically, it stays. And it stays quietly. Stones don't argue. They don't erode the truth with ego. They don't revise or rewrite. They simply carry, and in that carrying, they become more than things. They become companions of consciousness. That's why mystics didn't decorate with stone, they consecrated it. Each one placed with care, each one aligned, each one a container for something the mind might forget, but the heart would feel again the moment it touched it. Even now, hold a stone, sit with it, breathe near it for long enough with clear attention, and something begins to shift. It reflects, not because it has a mind, but because it has presence. Stone receives what you bring to it, and it holds it, not with drama, not with demand, just silence. The kind that doesn't leave, the kind that doesn't need proof, the kind that says, I was here, I am still here, I saw you. That's why they placed their prayers in stone. That's why they carved the names of gods, not to be remembered by others, but to be remembered by something that does not forget. Stone was the witness, and now we are remembering that it still watches. There's a subtle difference between programming something and charging it. Modern language treats them as the same, but to the mystic, they were worlds apart. To program is to impose, to instruct, to give direction with force. It's the language of control. But to charge, to truly charge, is to collaborate, to invite, to resonate. It's the language of relationship. Programming tells the stone, do what I want. Charging says, hold what I am. And the stone listens not to your words, but to your state. It mirrors what you bring to it. If you bring impatience, it reflects dissonance. If you bring ego, it reflects resistance. If you bring present stillness, clarity, it begins to hum in tune. This is why the mystics approached stones not as tools, but as partners in ritual. You don't dominate the object. You honor it. You attune yourself until what you carry can be received by something older than you. That's what the act of charging truly is. Not projecting into stone, but entraining with it. Aligning your field so it can absorb without resistance. Programming creates code. Charging creates communion. You're not forcing something into form. You're offering it gently, the way one places water into a bowl without spilling. That's why the ritual matters. That's why breath matters. That's why silence matters. Because you cannot charge a stone until you have stilled yourself enough to be received. And when it is received, the stone does not perform. It does not change the world. It simply holds. And holding is what allows you to return, to remember, to sit again with the self you were when you first offered that intention. This is the key. You don't charge the stone to act for you. You charge it to anchor you when you forget who you are. And over time, the difference becomes clear. Programming is loud, but it fades. Charging is quiet, but it remains. Because what you give with force may be repelled, but what you give with resonance is always received. The mind forgets, always. That's not a flaw, it's a function. It needs to forget in order to survive in a world of constant input. But sometimes what is forgotten was never meant to be discarded. It was sacred, subtle, a moment of presence too deep to keep in the everyday mind. And so the mystic placed it in a stone, not as data, as reminder, not as control, as return. The stone becomes a kind of memory bank, not for thought, but for being. A repository for your clearest state, your purest prayer, your truest vibration at a moment when you touched something real. The stone doesn't store your wish. It stores your presence when that wish was clean, when it came not from fear or lack, but from alignment. That's what the mystics did. They placed their moments of clarity into something that wouldn't drift, wouldn't forget, wouldn't rationalize it away. They left it there, like a candle left burning in an inner room so that when they wandered, and they always did, they could come back. Touch the stone, breathe, feel, remember. Not the story, the state. This is why ancient stones feel like they're watching, why they hum when held, why they change nothing but change you. They hold what you forget. Not because they are magical, but because they are faithful. Because stone doesn't need to be reminded of what it holds, only you do. And it waits without judgment, without urgency for the moment you stop running long enough to come back to what you once knew. And when you do, it doesn't speak. It simply hands you back to yourself. You don't charge a stone by doing, you charge it by being. Stillness is not preparation, it is the act itself. Because presence, not movement, is the real signature of intention. That's what the ancients understood. That energy doesn't transfer through willpower, it transfers through attunement. You become still because the stone is still. You slow your breath because the stone does not breathe. You soften your thoughts because the stone holds no opinion. And in that quiet symmetry, something happens. You align, not as a technique, as a natural result of presence. This is why the act of charging a stone was ritualized, not to dramatize it, but to protect the quality of attention. The stiller you are, the clearer the transfer. Because in the silence between breath and thought, intention becomes symbol. And symbol, that's where everything lives. A symbol is not an idea. It is a condensed presence. It holds meaning the way a flame holds heat, quietly, steadily, constantly. When a mystic places intention into stone, they do not store information. They store a symbolic field. Not a sentence, a state, not a command, a communion. The stone becomes a symbol of a self you once were and can be again. And this is its power. Not to change your future, but to stabilize your present, to give your wandering mind a place to return to, and in that return, remember what matters. That's why the charged stone does not pulse with magic. It doesn't glow. It doesn't act. It waits. Quiet, heavy, true. Because what you gave it wasn't a demand. It was a mirror of a state you wished to carry and couldn't always maintain on your own. Stillness, symbol, presence. That's the real trinity of this practice. Not energy, not power, not performance, but resonance. The kind that holds you when you forget to hold yourself. And in that, a simple stone becomes sacred. Every act of intention leaves a trace, not just in the stone, but in you. You think you're placing something into it, a hope, a prayer, a presence. And yes, you are. But in doing so, you're also forming yourself. Because attention shapes the world and also the self that gives it. When you charge a stone with clarity, you're not just imprinting the object, you're revealing something about your own center. You're drawing a line. This is what I believe. This is what I'm ready to hold. This is who I am when I'm not performing. And that moment, that quiet, exact moment, becomes a reflection. You leave something in the stone, yes, but the stone in turn leaves something in you. A memory of stillness, a weight of presence, a geometry of choice. This is why the mystics returned again and again to the same object, not because it changed, but because they had. And each return was a realignment. Not a resetting of the stone, but a recentering of the self back to the shape they once knew. The shape they once became in that act of charging. The stone holds the imprint, but the real echo lives inside you. And here is the mystery. The more care you place into it, the more care it draws from you. The more stillness you give it, the more stillness you begin to crave. The more honestly you offer your intention, the more honestly you begin to meet yourself. This is why a charged object is not passive. It doesn't perform, but it performs something within you, silently, over time. You begin to shape your life around the truth you placed into form. Not because the stone demands it, because you recognize it. You become accountable to your own clarity. And that's the true magic. What you place in stone does not just wait for you to return. It shapes the path you walk to get there. We live in a time of speed, of data, not presence, of motion without meaning, of attention divided until it forgets its source. In such a world, a practice as quiet and slow as charging a stone seems like myth, a relic, a superstition, long buried. But what is buried does not always die. Some things wait, silently, until the noise collapses under its own weight, and then they return. Not with fanfare, not with claim, but like a memory you didn't know was yours until it surfaced again. This practice, this act of sitting, breathing, placing attention into matter, it is returning. Not as ritual for show, not as something to sell, but as something the soul is beginning to crave again. Because in a world that forgets itself every day, we long for objects that remember. We long for weight, for slowness, for symbols that don't scroll away when we stop looking. And stone it waits. It doesn't argue. It doesn't update. It offers the same thing it always has, a space for your attention to become form. The mystics never really went away. They just grew quiet. But now, quiet is being sought again. Not as retreat, but as return. Return to the body, return to the breath, return to a way of placing presence into the world with care. So this practice, this ancient, deliberate, sacred act is not gone. It's just been waiting for you to slow down enough to remember it. And when you do, you'll see. The stones have been here all along, waiting, unmoved, holding space for the day you'd sit again, place your hand upon their silence, and remember what it feels like to mean something fully, to shape without words, to speak through stillness, to leave behind nothing but the presence you once became. That is the return, not of belief, but of being.